Good morning, everybody. I'm Noam. I'm a professor here at Columbia at the Business School. I'm very grateful to be here. There's a lot of merit in this room, and all of us at Columbia are very grateful to her initiative and to this conference. I'm the moderator. I don't like the term because in the early morning it sounds boring, but much better is the word provocateur, and it's French on top of it. So I'll try to do just that to provoke this panel. It's too bad I should explain that Tim Wu is not here. His brother was hospitalized. He had to go back to the West Coast. I hope everybody's all right. I will try to fill the gap. Since this happened last minute, some of you will have heard some of these things before. It's too bad that Tim isn't here because I'd hoped to have a strong advocate of what might be called, with due respect, the internet orthodoxy, that open is good, that universal is good, right? It's all part of the framing. Who can be against open? Who can be against universal? The theme of this panel. Once you accept these boxes, you're stuck in them. But suppose we frame this differently as uniformity, as lack of technological diversity, and as bureaucratization. So this is part of the discussion that we will have here. To me, this is not about giving Jackie Ruff more power or Andrew more international governance, but rather it's a question of diversity and dynamism. If one internet has been good, well, maybe multiple internets are even better. You've all heard about the splinternet and about how calamitous this would be. But this fear of change is backward thinking. Instead of mourning the passing of uniformity, perhaps we should embrace the emergence of technological and institutional policy diversity. I used to think that it was regrettable but unavoidable, and that already upset many people. Now I want to go one step further to argue that it is not only regrettable at all, it is actually a really good thing. At some point, as is often the case when a revolution succeeds, it becomes orthodoxy, even theology. And so the internet morphed from a technological system of data communications into a belief system with its saints and villains, its dogmas, its venerating founding fathers, its myth of creation, its sacred central text, its mesmerized followers, its jargon, its gathering of the faithful. It is true that many of the elements of this belief system were right at a certain point, but just because it was so at the dawn does not mean that it is now and will be in its maturity. Internet advocates see clearly and correctly that the internet is a force that disrupts everyone, everywhere. Where they go blind is to see that it is also the same force that similarly upends the internet itself. This seems so obvious, but people miss it. To oppose, so I will say, internet, go disrupt yourself. To oppose fundamental change here, that is truly conservative. We like it just the way it is, or was, or how we like to believe that it was. Just let's have more of it. Libertarianism on the periphery, but regulated conformity at the core. So how does this play itself out? As the internet becomes and became an essential part of economy and society and culture and politics, it became too important for governments to leave it alone. So they started kind of interfering, and the different policy approaches, of course, were different because different parts of the world and their governance systems and societies are different with different priorities. That is not surprising at all. What is surprising, actually, is that we had a uniform system at all. What we're experiencing here really is a return to normal, the international standards of everything else. So the question is, therefore, how do we deal with this? And one way to go is to go the route, bringing us here together and elsewhere, the route of a global system of governance. And there are many earnest and well-meaning efforts to bridge policy divergence here through international junkets of global Madisons of the internet. I've been there, you've been there, to many of them. They may succeed for a little while, but the reality is that the world is a multifaceted world, and that the internet is part of the world, and so it is multifaceted and will be. And this divergence will, in fact, increase in the future because the internet is becoming also a platform for mass media, television, and so on, and that is much more political and society relevant and divergent than data communications. It's not only countries and policies, but companies. They have different approaches. They want to do things differently, different technologies, different ways of things. And in fact, the more the internet becomes, the public internet becomes regulated as neutral and non-discriminatory and globally governed, the more likely it is that the network providers will migrate their traffic from the public internet to their private arrangements. They will connect those private arrangements with each other, and so the future of the internet might well be that it will become a system of an internet of internets, as it were. And the bridging between them and among them will be done by peer arrangements, by intermediate bridging institutions, commercial and public, of various forms. So there will be, of course, some loss here, loss of scale, loss of some technological efficiency in a static sense, but there will be a gain of technological dynamism and economic dynamism for that competitive discovery process that we otherwise advocate. We will talk about this here today. So how does this conclusion affect this debate over governance? If standards need not be uniform, as I will argue, why fight over them? Or even more, why fight over who gets to set these unessential standards? And this lowers the anxiety level considerably. Governance then becomes a bit of a highfalutin term. There's no need for global policy. And I would argue from a US perspective now for the moment, and not from an international, that it is actually for the US the better approach, because as things become internationally governed, the US is only one voice among many, a powerful voice for sure, but one voice of 200. It's the UN model and so on. But when you move to a freer system in which technology and companies and innovation and entrepreneurship govern, there the United States is much stronger, in a much stronger position. An ungoverned internet fits much more the American model. So when the governance model will not fit the US, which is inevitable, I think, there is an alternative. And having such a credible alternative also means that the international government debates don't go off the deep end because its most important player, the United States, has an alternative. So, seen in this light, we have before us a creative opportunity rather than an intractable problem. Instead of banging our head against the wall trying to achieve a uniformity, which satisfies nobody, we should find arrangements where different systems can coexist. And this should be the international agenda for the next few years. And in this, the time and the place to discuss this is here and now, right here in this panel, I hope. So I will now have the speakers in alphabetical order. Would you? Good. Our first speaker, Leslie Daigle. You have the biographies all in front of you, so we'll get to the point.
All right, thank you very much. Just by way of background, I'm a technologist by training and mostly by profession. And I think that I'll start by saying I think that indeed we have a universal internet, and that is something that is important to preserve, but I don't think it needs to be preserved through uniformity. Indeed, the internet is a network of networks which celebrates diversity. There are some invariant properties of the internet, some things that have characterized it since its inception that are important to preserve as we move forward, even as they have absolutely nothing to do with the specifics of technology. Indeed, internet, challenge yourself, come up with new technologies. TCP/IP has been pivotal as the basis of the internet, but now that Vint has had to leave, I can say we can come up with new internet transmission control protocols and still have an internet. But the things that we need to preserve, and particularly in the name of preserving universality, I think, are the global reach and integrity of the internet. Right now that is provided by having a universal global addressing system. There are challenges to that, but that is part of what makes us have a single internet the world over. And it's partly why we capitalize the I in internet, because there is an internet. We are still capitalizing that, right? We're not getting lazy and writing with little I internet. And because of this global reach and integrity, you can connect to it, and no matter where you connect to it, you see the same internet, whether you're connecting from somewhere in Africa or here in downtown New York City. It's accessible. You can put a host on the internet anywhere and have it launch a service, capture content, provide content, and make it part of the internet world. From the standpoint of capability, there is no notion of you either have the business internet or you have the personal use internet. It is the internet. And a lot of times we've seen over the course of the last decade or more, things that people thought were just their personal pastimes become their businesses, for instance, as it empowers people to reach across the globe and become so much more than they ever might have otherwise imagined. A key characteristic is that this is a network that is general purpose. Seems kind of obvious. It's not built for any particular application. The previous global network, the telecommunications network that we knew in previous decades, was built specifically for voice. And that had attendant limitations in terms of how universal the set of services it could support. And as was mentioned in the earlier session, the internet is based on collaboration. It really is about everybody's responsibility to contribute to the internet, to help address it when there are problems. And yes, that actually even does mean that when there are competing private interests, private companies need to come together and figure out what is the right answer for the internet and what are we going to do about it. And surprisingly, that really does happen more often than the pessimist might think. So again, it's not, this whole notion of the universal internet is not a function of a specific set of technologies, but the choices that we make do impact whether or not we have an internet, a universal internet going forward or not. And my thesis is that we need to preserve those properties, not the specific technologies. I think fragmentation is a real challenge right now. I think that there are many subtle ways in which the internet is becoming fragmented. And in cases where we think we're trading off a little bit in order to achieve a greater goal, we're missing the point in terms of how much we're actually losing. So SOPA PIPA, which was mentioned earlier, might have sounded like, well, we're just going to ask the ISPs to do this one little thing and affect the DNS technology in this tiny little way. But the problem was that's not impacting the technology of today only. It's actually cutting off the entire set of future generations of internet naming technology. So little drops in the ocean, it seems, actually have big rippling effects in terms of limiting our future. And indeed, international reactions to things like the revelations about NSA spying have big impact as well, because, for instance, the other governments reacting to the notion that US might be spying on their citizens' traffic produce calls for things like, let's reroute where the internet goes, let's make sure that we can be in control of everything, all the data that our citizens have and where it goes. And as was mentioned on the earlier panel, that's just not the way the internet is architected. And if the internet were architected that way, there are a number of ways in which we would lose all of those earlier properties that I mentioned, including the global integrity and access. So there is an internet, and we really do need to work to continue to have an internet, even as it supports a vast diversity of uses and technologies and potential futures. I think one of the things that we're seeing driving this fragmentation or this challenge between policy and technology is the fact that the ease of interaction between people across the globe is challenging our whole understanding of what it means to be part of a culture or part of a nation. And that's not the problem. The problem is that we need to find ways to get our policy approaches to grow up to that fact, to grow up to the fact that the whole notion of what it means to be a citizen on this planet is evolving. And we need new ways to address these grand problems, to interact globally and come up with answers to the actual problems and not just keep hacking at the technology.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And now by alphabetically, Jackie Ruff of Verizon.
Well, I think that the conference has gotten off to an excellent start with the opening session and, of course, the comments that Leslie just provided. I want to focus today on a certain part of the internet ecosystem and certain themes. Being from Verizon, you might find these to be expected, namely infrastructure, investment, and regulation. As Vince said at the beginning and others have echoed, the internet is a complex ecosystem that includes many different types of infrastructure. Verizon's global networks around the world are an integral part of what we've come to refer to as the network of networks. For the internet to be open, which was the theme, open and universal, that Ellie asked us to think about, these networks need to be ubiquitous, seamless, secure, and resilient. And ubiquity requires connecting billions more users to high-speed networks, be it with more undersea cables, terrestrial backbone, and most importantly, wireless networks. There are about 4.5 billion people today using mobile phones, but not everybody is using them. About 3 billion using the internet, but that still means that about 60% of the world is not connected to the internet. But on the positive side, on the promising side, within about 4 years, about half of all mobile devices used will be smartphones, that is, connected to the internet. In that period, mobile data will also increase tenfold. So huge numbers of people to be connected and networks to be upgraded. What will it take to do that? Some of the scale of investment that we've seen recently is that just last year, the global mobile industry spent about $200 billion to upgrade networks. We're in the process of upgrading them to 4th generation networks. So will these investments continue? How can they be accelerated in order to make ubiquity a reality? It'll require a pro-investment public policy frameworks that attract the capital. Companies and investors have to be convinced to make the large investment that will be the best use of their capital now and in the future. What can we do to promote and incent that type of investment? A light touch approach to the regulation of the internet ecosystem will create the best incentives. And Vint, I thought, was very compelling when he said we've really got to be thinking of incentives as the way to move things forward. We saw this in the US when the high-speed networks were built only after the FCC decided against utility-style regulation for broadband. That flexibility opened the door for Verizon, for example, to spend $23 billion to build out a fiber-to-the-home network in part of our country. In contrast, the recent decisions by the FCC to reclassify internet access as a public utility under Title II is a troubling move in the wrong direction and an ill-advised signal to the rest of the world. Maybe Larry Strickland was right that we should have had a multi-stakeholder approach instead, but we have what we have. And it's particularly troubling because we are at a crossroads globally regarding whether government should intervene more in internet networks and services. It was interesting, I was reading a paper published by Aspen Institute last month that looked at the trend in the US of moving toward greater regulation and made a compelling case that that is retarding investment in our market, which I think is something that is relevant around the world. So we are seeing a move to regulate more. We saw it at the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU. India and even Europe are studying options for imposing telecom-style regulation on services such as search, social networks, internet-based messaging, content storage, and cloud services. I think one of the greatest risks to the seamless nature of the internet is the localization that Laura talked about. And again, they're very serious proposals that have been out there on that. Last year, a law even adopted in Russia, considered in Brazil, but fortunately not adopted, heavily promoted by India at the ITU. And even in Europe, There's been consideration of Europe-only cloud, Germany-only email, and moving along that spectrum, the more extreme version, of course, is outright governmental censorship and blocking of content. So I would urge, and in our discussion, as we think about all these things, that fundamental questions should include, if there are moves like that toward greater regulation, ask, will it create incentives for investment? Will it enabling the offering of innovative, high-quality services? Will it avoid costs that are associated with fragmentation, regulatory friction costs? And I think there's a very clear case that the fragmentation does drag down quality and resiliency, facilitates censorship and other governmental control, requires new mechanisms for interoperability and reconciling, widens the digital divide, since it's never going to be possible to build data centers in every single country if you want to have localization, and denies developing countries opportunities to participate in cloud services and leapfrogging. So to Ellie's point, it's useful and important to think about what one would do if there is fragmentation, but my argument would be that it's all the more important to try to figure out if we can prevent that as much as possible, but we should certainly be discussing the interoperability mechanisms.
Thank you, Jackie. Andy Wyckoff, who says he normally is at the end of the line with his W initial, but in this case he is not. Andrew, OECD.
Thank you, Ellie. Yeah, it's a special day, that's for sure. Let me just say that I'm from the OECD, so I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, and one that is possibly a little bit more global, but I think one that, which is our hallmark, analytical, particularly with an evidence base, which is not so easy to get in this area. And I want to answer your first question of what's some of the key attributes for openness. And from where I sit, and I think Leslie touched on this, is what's called the end-to-end principle. The internet enables users to send and receive data to one of each other. The intelligence is more at the edges than at the center, and the network itself is really a little bit more of an agnostic. It's a conduit for carrying information, although that's a simplistic simplification. But there's a great paper I read on the airplane over here, one of the great things about having a long way to get here, by Dave Clark and Marjorie Blumenthal, written in 2001. On rethinking the design of the internet, which I would argue is a useful thing to reread for this debate. And from a policy perspective, what we really care about is the free flow of data, information, and even knowledge. And that's where I want to end up with one of Ellie's questions, which he asked us to look at the potential cost and benefits of fragmentation. But I think it's important first that we begin to think more analytically about a framework for how we think about fragmentation, because we're putting everything into it. And so, is the network becoming fragmented? I think the short answer is yes, at least from where I sit. But to elaborate upon that, I think we need to put it in two different categories. One would be, but it's by actor a bit. One is the public actors, the governments themselves, and then there's the private actors too, who I think come into this place. So let me just try to break it down from what I see. On the public side, I see four large buckets. There's concerns over sovereign authority, ensuring political stability, domestic criminal law enforcement, things like data retention laws. Second, public sectors to promote economic development. And these are issues like digital security risks or enforcing intellectual property. Third would be the protection of human rights and fundamental values such as privacy, that we've already talked about. And fourth would be the preservation of local values, which differ a lot around the globe, things like restrictions on hate speech or on activities like gambling. And these have different solutions to them, and they've already been talked about. I don't want to go into it, but I think there's a good distinction to be made, and Marjorie and Dave make this back in 2001 about what they call in-network solutions, which are those to the architecture themselves, and more on-the-network solutions, which are things such as data localization and notice and takedown regimes. But any of these, it's a network of network, can have really perverse, unintended effects that can be very hard to predict at the outset. So I think you have to be very careful. But I don't think it's just the public sector. So there's private sector actions as well that are fragmenting. Walled gardens, proprietary protocols, data lock-in, termination monopolies, which still exist out there, and the stalled transition from IPv4 to IPv6. I think are all examples of this in a different frame. And I think I agree with Ellie's paper, which I suggest that you read, that some of these fissures are inevitable and are really the result of the maturing and scaling of the network. And so we begin to see a spectrum of fragmentation here. And the question is, where do governments or different actors want to place themselves? And here's where I have this analogy in my mind of it's almost like the trade protectionist dynamic, where the winners from fragmentation tend to be very visible and very localized, and why the losers tend to be much more diffuse. And they're just losing a little bit, but it's millions that are losing a little bit. And when you add all this up, it far outweighs the gains. But to make this argument, we need to assemble evidence. And that's what we do at the OECD, and that's what I just want to talk about a little bit, looking at the costs and the benefits. And from our perspective, and we've heard it a little bit this morning, which I'm very happy to hear about, we want to look at two large cost-benefit equations. One is on innovation and entrepreneurship, and the second is on international trade itself. And if you look at innovation, and I don't need to tell anyone in this room, it is an amazing platform. And it's really the end-to-end principle, I think, that has helped this come to fruition. But it's even way back in the science system when you look at things, and actually the origin of the World Wide Web was in CERN, of all places, one of the premier science establishments of the globe. And science has become very data intensive. And Microsoft has a great book on this called The Fourth Paradigm. But you don't do science anymore without very heavy data. And gaining access to that data is how you do the research, and that is through the internet. And when you begin to shut some of this down, you shut yourself off from these resources for innovation. There's some good work going on recently, both at the OECD and elsewhere, that looks at the internationalization of science and how important collaboration is, largely done over the internet, for improving scientific excellence. This is especially important for smaller countries that lack the scale to do frontier scientific research. And if they begin to cut themselves off from this, I think there's going to be very counterproductive effects. And this is where I have some issue with Ellie, because federated internets would limit some of the serendipity that is essential for innovation. This collision, this orthogonal thinking that sometimes comes from different disciplines, cultures, and so forth, which you really need, I think, to advance innovation. I want to quickly get to the second factor, which is that of international trade. Because, yep, very little trade is done by final goods anymore. 3/4 of international trade is in intermediate inputs. We operate in a world of fragmented production functions that operate through global value chains. Almost every product is delivered this way. These global value chains are very data intensive. That's how you organize these global value chains. You start to restrict data flows within these firms across these borders, and these trade benefits will decline quickly. And the countries that will lose most are those that cannot afford to make a fully integrated product. They're just making one component, such as Thailand does for Toyota, on the controllers they use in those cars, the chips that control the car. And so these global value chains are very data intensive, and you add the smallest friction to this, and because they're multiplying across borders many times, and the costs end up being very high. My last point, we estimate that just for the low-income countries, the inefficient document processing and the lack of information availability at customs adds 5% to their trade costs. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what we could begin to see if we really shut this down. It's also a critical new sea lane for trade in general, because many products have been digitized. We'll conducting this work over the next year. We benefit greatly from some of the firms represented in this room who are opening up their data to us, and we're looking for data sources. So this is a plea. If you know of other data sources to help us with this work, we would appreciate it. Thank you for the extra time.
Thank you, Andrew. And now, final speaker on this panel in this round, and then I'll open it to questions. Chris Yu, Penn.
No, thank you very much. I feel a certain responsibility and blame for us being here today, and this is more appropriate to have Tim in here. Tim was the first person to coin actually the phrase network neutrality, and he wrote an article in 2003. I wrote a direct response to that in 2004, so I guess I wrote the second article in this line. He wrote a reply to me, and we're off to the races since. I guess I'll take responsibility for getting it started. I won't take responsibility for keeping it going quite as long as it has. There's been a lot of people who contributed to that. But what I found is I really welcome Larry Strickland's comments earlier about how the debate has turned into an unhealthy one of adopting labels, which is people began to say, are you for something or against something, and discussing things in terms that don't really call for a middle ground, and don't call for a diversity of responses in a way that Ellie appropriately criticizes as a need for uniformity. And there is some great deal of value to standardization. But the question is, there's no principle in that about how far you take that and how far you limit it. And as Andrew's pointed out, in different environments, the balance ought to be different. And that's something that we may lose. Jackie pointed out that we have, of the 7 billion people in the world, 4 billion have no internet connectivity as of today. I would say, as a starting point, the differences of what people, the 3 billion who are already connected from the internet need in terms of policy responses is very different from what the 4 billion who do not have connectivity need. So we're in the United States, we're among the 3 billion that has connectivity. What are the things we discuss? We talk about things such as greater competition in connectivity. We talk about things about more applications, a great availability of applications. We're talking about multiple forms of connectivity and trying to figure out how that's all going to work. And in fact, we're moving now from a world in the US where we used to have a single internet connection, in a world first of smartphones and now tablets, most of us have redundant multiple connections, which changes the space where we used to think every connection had to be everything to everybody, but we're now going to have to support different technologies in very different ways. The have-nots have a very different question. The idea of competition for them is a nonsensical proposition. They're trying to get a single provider into the space. The idea of facilitating apps and creating a great diversity of apps, if there's no connectivity, that's sort of a second-order consideration behind getting base connectivity in the first place. So they would put the balance more on facilitating investment in the core infrastructure, perhaps prioritizing that to a greater degree than we would here about promoting an app environment. And that is a perfect example. What Andrew's talking about is a different tailored regulatory response for what is a very, very different underlying situation. So what's fascinating to me is even within the developed world, we've had a huge growth in the way people use the internet. So a growth in the diversity of the way people are using it. It used to be the plaything of academics, and the first things that dominated were email and web browsing. In technical terms, these are relatively simple applications. They're file transfer applications. You're transferring a file from one computer to another. Now in a world of video and interactive voice, we have a very different set of demands. And that what you'll see is, as has been acknowledged, we have a huge trust problem that Laura mentioned earlier, that this is a fundamentally different part of the network as it's grown. And there's a fabulous article, not just, I recommend what Andrew mentioned about the Blumenthal and Clark article in 2001. They wrote another one that said, how does trust change things? And in fact, what we should think about is offshooting, putting some security problems off the edge into the core of the network. But really the question is not, is it an edge, but is it a trusted edge? Is it a point where you can actually rely on what they're doing? Other people need bandwidth. You know, network video just wants to throw out lots of bandwidth, but doesn't have the same issues of trust. Other places in the cloud want reliability. They don't necessarily need huge amounts of bandwidth. They just need enough to get a virtual screen up. And what we're starting to see is as people want different things from the network, they're going to be very different demands. So what's fascinating to me is there are a bunch of applications. As much as we like sharing bandwidth and universal connectivity and how that's yielded benefits to the internet, which have not found a good platform in the internet to support what they need. So I'll give you a couple easy examples. Financial services has exited the internet altogether. They need microsecond latencies, perfect records, and ex-post auditability. Those are 3 services the current internet doesn't support. And so they actually have left. And that is part of the fragmentation we see. Many corporations, private networking using IP-based protocols are very common today. And what we're starting to see is innovations in the developing world, particularly, and even in the developed world, of things we call zero rating systems. They will give you not a full smartphone, but a feature phone which doesn't support everything, with something like Facebook provisioned as the front page. And the difference they're making is Facebook Zero, your traffic to Facebook doesn't count against your data cap. Now this is favoring one application over the others, both in terms of price and in terms of placement. And what's fascinating to me is in the world we live in, that has become a major adoption driver in a lot of the world. We like to think on the supply side, the traditional regulatory response is pricing and investment. There's a wonderful study done by 2 FCC staffers and 2 people at a place called Connected Nation, which wires rural communities in the US. They actually polled among the people who do not subscribe to broadband in the US. The answer was, they asked them why, and 2/3 of them would not take it at any price. They would not take it if it were free. For them, what they need is a use case that really demonstrates to them the value. And if you say, hey, you can keep in touch with your grandchildren through this, all of a sudden they have their use case. And that's happening in India, it's happening in a lot of other countries and places we've talked to in ways that broaden our thinking in very important ways. A couple closing comments about fragmentation. It's fascinating. The other thing that people talk about fragmentation is the concerns about fragmenting the address space. That is one of the core principles of the first Surfing Con paper on this point. What's fascinating to me is we actually have a fragmented address space. One that will be intuitively familiar to a lot of us. Skype does not use the normal numbering system. They have an internal numbering system which we can port out on a less preferred basis, but we actually have parallel numbering systems there. But one that's much more ubiquitous is IPv6. We chose, as a matter of policy, not to fold the IPv4 address system into the IPv6 system. And in fact, right now, we have 2 entirely separate parallel address systems running on the internet today. And I would suggest that there's some downsides to that. It makes it clunky. But the answer that we have different address needs, and we have hashes, we have all these other ways to make things run faster, and we're constantly looking for ways to optimize. And what that strikes me is this puts us in a world now we can talk about optimization. If there's one protocol or one set of economic principles that always work, this is very simple. Deploy that everywhere, ignore your conditions. In general, that's not what we see. So what we see in the economics about standardization and being part of one network, there is a benefit to being part of one network. But there's a trade-off between, and this is recognized in one of the earliest RFCs out of the IETF, there's a trade-off between generality and efficiency. Is that if you're going to design something that can do everything for everybody, there's a trade-off. So when we had kids, I found this new device that was both a car seat and a baby stroller. And it was very flexible, but what I discovered was it wasn't a great car seat and it wasn't a great baby stroller, because it had to make concessions to be able to be flexible to both. And those, I can give other examples, but that's a classic one. If the value of specificity outweighs the value of being part of a larger network, that's when people exit and create their own situations, either customized one-off software or private networks or something like that. That's the economic side. On the technical side, there's a whole bunch of other things that are going on that deviate from the end-to-end solution. Firewalls are a good example that are put out in the trade. And oddly enough, one of the big demons to a lot of the technical community is something that's almost in all of our homes. A Wi-Fi router, because it employs a technology called network address translation, breaks the end-to-end visibility of the network. And you'll see, it's one of these things like, so my Wi-Fi router is so bad. If you look at engineering text, some people, at the textbook level, they say, oh, this is such an established debate, we're not going to go into it. Some people think it's the devil. Some people think it's an incredibly practical solution to a real-world problem. And differences in security, what we're starting to see on the technical level is there's some solutions that are better handled in different ways that deviate slightly from the idealized architecture we begin with. And I would go into a world where I think we need database analytics that allow us to make trade-offs for particular situations, instead of throwing slogans at each other saying, this is the way the internet's been in the past as I see it, and it should always be that way, and go into a world where we can get a rational conversation, where we can make trade-offs that are dynamic with the different situations and demands that things require.
Thank you very much. We now have 20 minutes left. We started a little late, but we're going to end mostly on time. Is there anybody here from the panel who would like to address other panelists in 30 seconds or less?
I would like to address a little bit of what Christopher was just getting at, and a little bit of what you touched on at the beginning, in that I don't think that there needs to be such a perception of polarization between universality and diversity and being able to build new things fit for purpose. The point of interoperability and open standards is not that the same size fits all, but rather completely the opposite. It's what is the minimum we need to agree on in order to be able to talk to each other using our different implementations, our different perspectives, and so on. And that's why I come back to having, to understanding what are the fundamental and varying principles, not to be restrictive, but rather to be a platform for increasing diversity.
Any other responses? No. In that case, let's go to you, the audience, with questions. If you have a question, please, there's someone here with a mic, right? And would you kindly identify yourself? And a question is something with a question mark at the end. So go ahead.
I'm not just raising voice.
Who is the next, so we can already route the mic if there's a second one? Any other question? Well, all right. Go ahead.
Thank you for your patience. Jason Healey with SEPA. And I'm curious, like the central between the fragmentation or not, I hadn't really thought of as a serious question before this, and so I really appreciate the panel. But my question right now is going to go to Andrew for a second, because I really liked how you're talking about that internet is the new C lanes, and if you cut off data flows, you cut off trade. I know OECD has been doing tons on metrics and measurements in this. Can we support that? Do we have good data sets that say, as we see sovereignty being one kind of fragmentation, are we seeing, do we have hard data that's showing this is what then happens to trade? You know, can we go to a 5% increase in borders leads to a 10% decrease in trade? Are we testable yet on that?
Thanks for that question. The data in this area is less than what we would like. Even trade data, truth be told, is pretty crummy, and we can get into that. So you have to, you know, but that's where we're headed. And that's, I'm very happy, but the problem is we're used to using data from national statistical organizations who come and sit at our table. We have a whole bureaucracy for getting that. That isn't very helpful here. And so instead, we're going to global firms that can give us a sense of these flows, where they go to. And I don't want, it's not just the internet firms, it's firms in traditional sectors that we need to talk to. Because again, I don't think a lot of people understand that so much of trade happens the way it does these days. And trade for this country is big, but frankly, it's 5, 10, 7% of your GDP. I'm looking at Larry, he's from Commerce. But for other countries in Europe, it is gigantic. And it is like the trade between, think of trade between Pennsylvania and New Jersey is large. Well, that's what Germany sees with its neighbors. And it's those things we need to begin to tease out. And I think this could have a beneficial effect on some governments that are thinking of going a different way when I begin to show them just the economic data. Sorry. Long response.
Yes.
Could I just
Jackie.
These are very important and interesting questions, and a couple quick thoughts on it. We really are in a period that Andy's referring to where the internet is becoming so important to entire economies, to all sectors. So one has to figure out data-based analysis that takes that into account. On the localization issue, actually there were some interesting studies by an organization, the acronym is ECIPE, and it's based in Brussels, and it looked at the impact on, I think it was on GDP of some countries where there might be localization, so it was country specific.
Thank you. Question? There in the back, all the way in the back.
So, Ellie, while the mic is moving, can I respond to one thing that Les has been said? Because I don't think we disagree as much as you might think, in the one sense that I do think when you design a standard, you try to put the minimum in. I have two concerns about this. One is, from the very beginning of IPv4, they put a prioritization flag in called the type of service flag. So this is part of the minimum standard. Second, when we moved to IPv6, they not only kept that, they added a flow label flag, which is designed to actually make that possible more. And part of what I see in the debate is a desire for people not to use the functionality built into the minimum content that the engineering committee decided needed to be in there. Second quick thought, standards, I agree with you, standard setting is the way. Standards are adopted voluntarily. You hold them out. Most standards aren't even adopted. It's all done by consent. What we see in certain regulatory spaces is an attempt to essentially legislate certain standards into code, either for a minimum portion or for the entire internetwork. And I think that if I understood what you're saying, a standard-based world I actually think is a wonderfully good idea. What I worry about is people trying to move it from a truly standard-based world into a more regulatory.
In the back.
Hi, thank you very much for that. It's Rohan Kariwasam. I'm a telecoms engineer and a professor of law from the UK. Just because we have a separate panel on trade.
Could you
we
speak
have a
up?
separate panel on trade this afternoon, but I thought that because the panel were talking about standards and the interconnection of networks, I'd like to ask this question. When we talk about interconnection of networks for packet switch service networks and the standards that associate with interconnection, we have, if you like, global rules set by the WTO through the regulatory reference paper. These set out minimum standards for interconnection between different networks in different countries. What I'm curious about is with the classification of a service, such as, say, packet-switched networks or packet-switched switching, we have, if you like, mandated rules that require different networks to connect with each other. How do you see this internet of internets if we have this basic classification of packet-switched services as data services affecting the interconnection of networks in the future?
Any responses here? It sounds like our law professor will give you the engineering answer. Go ahead.
Well, it's interesting. Traditionally, there's never been, most of the international organizations have stopped short of mandating interconnection or actually regulating them. Back to the telephone ITU days, they have a framework, but it stopped short of what we call a WTO-style enforcement mechanism. And that, in fact, by and large, most interconnection within broad technical guidelines have happened by bilateral negotiations and individual consent. And so what tends to have happened, and one of the problems that many people complain about is part of that is also confidentiality. So we don't know a great deal about what these are saying, and part of the move is to make that all a great deal more transparent. What I would, I guess the reaction that most people have had is that this has worked pretty well, and that in fact prices and different opportunities is how we've created incentives to add bandwidth where it's necessary. It's created regional exchanges. It's promoted an incredible diversity of interconnection arrangements, which has only made the network more robust and efficient. And I think that's all to the good. One of the interesting tropes in the open internet debate is that we've been fighting about this for over a decade. Actually, we were fighting about non-blocking in 2004, 2005. It became non-discrimination in 2009, 2010. And it picked up interconnection in 2014 and 15. And each of those is an incremental change, and the actual debate over how the interconnection regulatory apparatus would work is very underdeveloped. And most of our reference points are in telephone, where traditionally on wireless and some other places, we have not universally mandated interconnection, but have had a backstop regime that if people choose to interconnect, it has to be on certain standards.
Leslie.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
3 points. One, mandating something like interconnections is a problem because mandates basically tend to be for a situation that was, not the situation that is or will be, and they're hard to update. 2, this is in a large part why there was a strong resistance to trying to make the internet part of the telecoms treaty in the Wyckoff meeting that Larry mentioned earlier in 2012. You can't just take all of the telecom regulations and think that they can be applied to the internet per se. And 3, there is a lot of work being done in terms of interconnections or IXPs for the internet, and it turns out that the best way to actually make those work is for people to collaboratively sit down and to determine at a given point in time what is the right place and who are the right people to come together and interconnect in order to improve the lot of the local infrastructure. And there are references to papers where where those points has changed over time.
We have a question here and a mic there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ahmed Abdel Latif. I'm from Egypt. I'm based in Geneva at the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. So each time I witness this discussion, I'm reminded of this object that I have to carry with me coming from Europe, which is a travel adapter. I keep losing it. I always buy new ones. And yet we live in a world that seems to accommodate the fact that we use different plugs. Governments approve it. So, and I think there's a huge economic case of efficiency gains of harmonizing this. Yet, this is accepted. This is the situation. Right? So I don't see, if we cannot solve this basic problem, right? What is the policy driver? Beyond principled positions and multi-stakeholder participation, et cetera, that can lead us to effect the changes in internet governance or to preserve the open internet, et cetera, beyond a technical breakdown of the current system. That, in that case, really, where we have a strong impediment. So that is my question and comment.
Well, we are certainly very, very unhappy that you have, all of us have been in that situation. On the other hand, you have a phone that is not compatible with this operating system, with that operating system, which has actually kind of worked reasonably well to kind of get us to where we are now. So there are pluses and minuses. Go ahead.
I just want to say, I think the intent of our work is just to have people, yeah, that's a pain, but it's a relatively small pain, although multiplied out. But what we want to show is to have governments make a more informed decision where they want to rest on that continuum between open and closed. And I just want to show them kind of what might it cost you in terms of innovative capacity, which means your economy in the future, and trade, which is your economy right now. And I'm not saying, it's just to give them an evidence-based and informed decision. So my answer to you is, what will make them move? It's about money.
And what's fascinating, most of the times you don't need to make people move. I mean, one of the things about network economics is that if there's enough inertia on one side, everyone adopts. So USB cables for printers. We used to have to go to a store and buy a new printer cable every time we bought a printer. We've solved that problem, and no one had to make them once the standard was announced. Mini USB chargers for your cell phone has worked, except for Apple. And it's an interesting question. Is in this world, should we coerce Apple? And we're about to find out in a very interesting sort of way, because the EU has adopted a standard requiring this, and we'll see if they can budge Apple. But in a world, I mean, it's a very bizarre thing. The other thing I would say, oddly enough, if you look at the literature on network economic effects and standardization, the precise existence of that device you hold in your hand weakens the need for regulation. Because if you have adapters that allow you to bridge between systems, you actually lose, the welfare loss from doing that becomes very, very small. The flip side is, if you choose your standard wrong or too soon or too durably, it can have bad effects. So one of the things we allowed in the US is standards competition in wireless between what is GSM and what became EVDO or CDMA. And we saw some benefits from that. In fact, CDMA found the technology that was the better bridge to the wireless internet that now is built into every LTE phone there is. And so that's, some people regard a standards competition and permitting that as part of a healthy, dynamic environment. The trick is finding out, are the moments, not just where standardization is good, but where it's good, but the market is structured in a way that people won't do it voluntarily. And that narrows the space of regulatory intervention by a great deal.
I have bad news for you, Chris. Apple is coming out with its USB-C terminal.
So one more point I'd like to make is it's interesting that you used travel adapter as the example of this, because for any given country, the portion of the population that actually travels, particularly travels to other countries where different norms apply, is relatively small, and it is a conscious choice, right? You know when you're going to travel, and you sort of accept, along with jet lag, maybe you'll have to have your travel adapter. Whereas with the internet, two things. One, much more of the population of most countries are actually using it and traveling outside of the resources that are in their own country. And they often are not conscious of the fact that they are doing so. And I think those are two really key differences and potential drivers for why we actually have to get our minds into a framework thinking less about national boundaries and more about how do we solve problems.
Question? Any other responses here?
It does occur to me a couple things about electric power. It says, this is one of my pet peeves, is that people often hold it up as an example of universal interoperability. I would say two things. One is, even within the US, there's the International Heritage in 80. We have 110 power and 220 power for different devices that need it, and permit that sort of variation, standardized in different ways. The other thing is we're also looking at the edge. Many people say the internet should be, or telecom network should be more like the electric power network. The electric power network in its core is the most heavily managed network I know, because they have to balance production and a load 24/7, 365. There are no dropped packets on electric networks or busy signals on electric networks. They've got to actually match perfectly capacity and demand and production. And what you see there is you see market makers who actually do day-forward pricing, and then they do spot markets every 6 seconds, and the spot market can vary from the day-forward market 30 times. And they use very immediate price signals to calibrate all these different things because they have a network that's very sensitive to interactions. And it'll deal in an unpredictable environment. And so one of the funny things is I actually think many people point to the electric power examples as the parable of what we should do. I think it's a perfect example of why this problem is not as simple as we think.
Thank you, Chris. Jackie.
I was just going to take away some overall thoughts based on the interoperability question, because I think this has been a useful conversation, and that is one of the most important things for us to think about. So I'm sitting here, I'm saying, okay, what does this tell us? A couple of things were said earlier. One, for policy overall, if we keep it at the most general level, principle-based, et cetera, if we think about its need to be fit for purpose, including to some extent country by country, and then identify what are the mechanisms for interoperability, I truly think that that last piece is extremely important. And I know we have so many concerns, importantly, desires to address the privacy issues, and they often seem almost insurmountable. But actually, I think they are an area where we have demonstrated globally some mechanisms to do that. So we may be having serious discussions with Europe now, the US and Europe, on what to do specifically on that. But we have had safe harbor. I think we will figure out other things to do. There's been enormous progress in APEC, Asia Pacific area, for getting common denominators at a high level on privacy and then creating mechanisms to make those interoperable. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think it's future-oriented and shows us a way to deal with a lot of the things we've been talking about.
Well, our time is up here, so I would thank our panelists. We had a good discussion about the trade-off between universality and diversity in various ways, how to analyze these questions, how to approach them, the context, the data needs, the trade issues, the harmonization, the investment, the collaboration, the compatibility. So I think we got a lot out of this group of experts here, and I thank all of them and all of you.